This is an overview of the readings for the second module of Introduction to Language Documentation and Description. In this module, we look at language documentation from a historical perspective on how the field developed as a discipline in linguistics to where it is today. Some of the topics covered in these readings include definitions of what language documentation is, perspectives on the major themes of how the field has developed in the last 30 years, and also the question of how language documentation relates to endangered languages. These are the 6 references that are covered in this presentation. The 2 that are the minimum expected reading for this course are Himmelmann 2006, at least sections 1 through 3, and Austin 2016. It's recommended that you also look at Himmelmann 1998, at least to skim through it. So this is the paper that is often cited as the beginning of the development of language documentation as a distinct subdiscipline in linguistics. So Himmelmann 1998 is the first paper we'll discuss. In Himmelmann's 1998 paper on language documentation, a problem is described with the way that linguistics is approached in descriptive linguistics. Descriptive theory has almost exclusively been occupied with the procedures for analyzing primary data and presenting this analysis in the form of a grammar and a lexicon. Methodological issues with respect to obtaining and presenting primary data have never been dealt with in depth within descriptive linguistics. In recent decades, hardly any comprehensive collections of primary data have been published. Himmelmann seeks to resolve this issue in regards to data collection by conceptualizing language documentation as something distinct from language description. One of the reasons for doing this is that primary data can be analyzed in more than one way. And when primary data is treated only as a means to an end, that is, as a means to language description, then data collection becomes neglected. Himmelmann discusses 2 potential ways to approach language documentation, one which is called the edited version of field notes, and the other which is radically expanded text collection. In the edited version of field notes, a linguist who is collecting some data for a particular analysis then makes the notes or the data that were collected for that analysis available and accessible to others. In the radically expanded text collection approach, the one which Himmelmann advocates, data is not collected purely for the sake of one analysis, but there's a general collection of relevant data that could be used for potentially multiple analyses. In the rest of the paper, Himmelmann gives some ideas of what a language documentation program should look like. In discussing what should be recorded, Himmelmann emphasizes that language documentation should go beyond the traditional transcription of text to record many kinds of communicative events in their context, and this is particularly possible because of the availability of video recording. Himmelmann also says that linguists should record the communicative events that happen to occur in a particular community and not come with a predetermined set of types of events to record. And that the recordings should include communicative events that are both more and less planned along the spectrum. When considering how to go about recording, Himmelmann emphasizes that community and individual speaker rights and interests are privileged in deciding what to record and how it should be done, and that linguists should be attentive to the observer paradox and the unnaturalness that their presence may have on the recording event. Himmelmann also discusses community involvement, archiving, translating, annotating, and funding for language documentation. In this quote, Himmelmann further explains the distinction between description and documentation. This definition of the aim of a language documentation differs fundamentally from the aim of language descriptions. A language description aims at the record of a language, with language being understood as a system of abstract elements, constructions, and rules that constitute the invariant underlying structure of the utterances observable in a speech community. A language documentation, on the other hand, aims at a record of the linguistic practices and traditions of a speech community. And in this quote, Himmelman emphasizes primary data in language documentation. The major difference between the language documentation format and other formats that include primary data, in particular the standard format of descriptive linguistics, that is, grammar, lexicon, and text collection, pertains to the fact that the language documentation format is uncompromisingly data-driven. Several years later, Himmelman offered another paper defining language documentation in an influential collection of papers on the field. In this paper, Himmelman offers a concise definition of language documentation as a lasting multi-purpose record of a language with a broad interpretation of the word language in this context. Himmelman discusses three motivations for language documentation: language endangerment, research resources, and accountability. Research resources here refers to the fact that it requires a lot of time and money to collect information about a language, and that other researchers who are interested in that particular language should be able to take advantage of the resources that were spent in the past instead of having to spend their own resources to go and collect more data. The resources that are spent on collecting data should be maximized by making that data available. And accountability refers to transparency in analysis, that instead of simply giving one or two examples of some linguistic phenomenon to support an analysis, language documentation offers a much broader data set on which to base an analysis. Himmelman also discusses the basic format of what a language documentation corpus should look like. There are two main parts: the primary data, which includes both observable linguistic behavior, that is, people speaking, having conversations, or singing, or performing a ritual, and metalinguistic knowledge. Metalinguistic knowledge includes information about verb paradigms or pragmatic information about what words are taboo or appropriate in certain contexts. And then there's also an apparatus. And for Himmelman, the apparatus includes the metadata and annotation. Metadata being information about a particular recording, where and when it was done, who was involved, and annotation being extra information that makes the recording accessible to other people, such as typically the transcription and translation of a speech event. Himmelman also discusses the place of grammar and dictionary in language documentation, claiming that the grammar and dictionary on its own is not a language documentation corpus, but it can be considered an extended part of language documentation. On the goal of language documentation, Himmelman writes, "The goal is to create a record of a language in the sense of a comprehensive corpus of primary data, which leaves nothing to be desired by later generations wanting to explore whatever aspect of the language they are interested in." Himmelman emphasizes that language documentation should not be completely detached from description and the analysis and theory that goes with description. Without theoretical grounding, language documentation is in the danger of producing data graveyards, i.e., large heaps of data with little or no use to anyone. Theoretical concerns pertain to the methods used in recording, processing, and preserving linguistic primary data, as well as to the question of how it can be ensured that primary data collections are indeed of use for a broad range of theoretical and applied purposes. The next paper we'll look at is by Woodbury in 2011. This is published in the Handbook of Endangered Languages and is another overview and definition of language documentation. Woodbury offers a definition of language documentation as the creation, annotation, preservation, and dissemination of transparent records of a language. One helpful aspect of this paper is that Woodbury puts language documentation into a longer historical context, tracing it back to the work of anthropological linguist Frank Boas, who emphasized the importance of publishing a grammar, dictionary, and a collection of texts for each language a set of books that's become known as the Boasian Trilogy. Woodbury also discusses a number of themes that are important in language documentation, including the importance of prioritizing community agendas, the importance of considering the roles and training for all of the participants who collaborate in a language documentation project. Woodbury also discusses the role of description in language documentation and the importance of planning a language documentation corpus according to the context, not only the context where the language is spoken, but also to the larger academic context, considering what has already been documented and what documentation might be interesting for further linguistic analysis. In this quote, Woodbury describes the historical context of language documentation. Documentary linguistics, in its modern academic sense, is an ambitious re-welding of the splintered pieces of the Boasian framework for language study. It arose as speaker communities and linguists drew more attention to language endangerment, as scientific interest in linguistic diversity renewed, as information management technologies burgeoned, and as linguists began to engage with the social and ethical dimensions of their work. The next paper we're going to look at is Austin 2016, which is a retrospective looking at 20 years of progress in language documentation. This paper reviews a number of influential definitions of language documentation, looks at the influence of two large projects in language documentation, the DOBIS project and the email project, and particularly in their emphasis in setting best practices in data archiving. Austin then discusses what may have been missed in these approaches to archiving, particularly the questions of what kinds of recordings we want to have in an archive and what aesthetic quality those recordings should have, as well as what kind of language activity should be recorded in what context. Austin discusses the need to improve archive accessibility and some progress that had been made in that regard. Austin also sees a need to improve the relationship between documentation and revitalization. And Austin recognizes that there has been some improvement in recognition of documentation as academic work, even if the view of language documentation is still not equal to other branches of linguistics. In discussing the way the field of language documentation has evolved, Austin writes, in the early period of its development, there was a concentration on defining a model for language documentation and specifying best practices, tools, and analytical categories. However, the past 10 years have seen a shift in perspective responding to criticism of these early concerns. Today, there is more recognition of diversity of contexts, goals, methods, and outcomes of language documentation, and indications of the introduction of social models of research, especially in the area of archiving. Another retrospective on language documentation was published in the journal Language by Seifert, Evans, Hammerstrom, and Levinson. This paper includes a short summary of the theoretical and structural developments in language documentation. They also summarize some of the new linguistic facts that have been discovered and that now inform our linguistic typology thanks to language documentation programs. They summarize the rise of digital archives for storing these documentations of endangered languages and an overall increased rate of language description. In describing the progress made, they write, by virtue of the documentation movement, perhaps 500 additional languages now have archived primary records with annotations. The authors also point out a number of areas for improvement in language documentation. One is that progress is concentrated in a few universities, and that most of the top universities in the world are not involved in language documentation. They also point out that there is not enough comparable material in language documentation projects, which prevents typologists from making generalizations across languages. They point out to a lack of emphasis of sociolinguistic analysis and semantic analysis in language documentation projects. And they also address the general problem of the transcription bottleneck, that is, many more materials have been recorded in video or audio than have been transcribed. In general, the amount of time it takes to transcribe is an overwhelming obstacle for most language documentation projects. The last paper is another overview or an introduction to an edited volume of papers that are looking back over the last 20 years of language documentation. This paper is the introduction to a special issue of language documentation and conservation, where the editors summarize the contents of the articles. In the first part of the journal, the authors are reimagining documentary linguistics, or introducing ways that they would like to see language documentation change or improve. One issue is the question of emphasis on speakers versus languages. That is, should a documentation corpus try to document one particular grammatical code, or should it document the linguistic practices of a particular group of people? Another perspective on language documentation is the importance of language documentation for reproducible results to provide more transparency in linguistic analysis. Another issue is that of the transcription challenge, not only the transcription bottleneck and the problem of finding faster ways to transcribe recorded material, but also the question of theorizing how language should be transcribed and what the implications of different approaches to transcription are. There's also discussion of decolonizing language documentation, taking into account the historical inequalities between the countries where most researchers come from and the countries where most of these languages that are endangered are being spoken, and the question of public engagement in language documentation and how linguists should relate to the general public. The second part looks at a number of key issues, ongoing issues in language documentation. One is the focus on the human aspects of language documentation and how to take that into account when focused on data. Another is the aspect of collaboration and the number of different ways that collaboration can happen. Others write about the ethics of language documentation, question of how to find funding for language documentation, and ongoing developments in technology for language documentation. The third part of the collection is articles that look at the relationship between documentation and description, as well as the importance of lexicon and text in documentation projects. And the fourth part of the journal articles is a collection of diverse perspectives on language documentation from people who have worked on documentation in different parts of the world. In describing the importance of language documentation, the editors write, the recognition that documentation, not description, is more likely to have a lasting impact requires us to rethink the way we do linguistics. This does not mean that we need to stop doing description. It also does not give us license to ignore linguistic theory. In fact, quite the opposite. A renewed focus on primary data makes possible a data-driven science of linguistics in which theory is more robustly grounded in primary data, yielding reproducible results. What this renewed focus does do is lead us to think more carefully about the collection of primary data as an end unto itself. This is the heart of the emerging field of documentary linguistics, as articulated by Himmelman in 1998. These are the references just covered. For more information on language documentation, there are a number of edited volumes available. We've looked at articles from 2 of these volumes already in this overview.